Unfortunately, there are villains who cannot be stopped, nothing is sacred to them, and everyone is at risk of becoming the next victim of a robbery, rape, or a true bloodbath driven only by animalistic aggression. On the evening of January 15, 1984, the Bennett family in Aurora, Colorado, USA, celebrated the birthday of Melissa, the eldest daughter, who was 7 years old. Her parents were Bruce and Deborah. Late in the evening, Bruce offered the mother and her husband to stay overnight, but the woman decided to drive home, and this decision probably saved their lives. When she left the house around midnight, Constance noticed that the garage door was unlocked but didn't pay it much attention. Bruce and Deborah worked together with her mother, Constance, in the family business, a furniture store. The young people were very punctual and never late for work, but on January 16, they did not show up at the store on time. Constance was worried because this was entirely uncharacteristic of her son and his wife. Even if the couple had problems, they always warned her if they were prevented from coming or would be late, and they never did so without a good reason, so their complete absence was suspicious. Constance suspected they had continued celebrating their daughter's birthday after her departure and had drunk too much, although this was also uncharacteristic for them. She tried to call the couple, but no one at the house answered, which was also troubling. Not wanting to torment herself with doubts, Constance decided to drive to the family's house to make sure they were okay. She arrived there around 10 a.m. and parked the car in the driveway. The garage door was fully open, which immediately alarmed her. It was more open than the previous evening when she had left the house. The silence was also unsettling. The normally loud, cheerful, and active family was now quiet. She decided to walk through the garage since it was wide open. Inside, it was empty, but she immediately noticed that the front door to the house was ajar, which increased her unease, for Deborah and her husband never left the house open to outsiders. Constance decided to go inside and approached the door cautiously. She opened it just a step and immediately saw a pool of blood that dripped down the stairs. It was almost dry by that point. In the last corner of the staircase, she saw her son. He was covered in blood and showed no signs of life. His mother called his name, but he did not respond. Constance then called Deborah and the girls by name but heard no answer. She hesitated to go up the stairs and immediately called the police. The police officers arrived at 10:28 a.m. and immediately began searching the house in the hope of finding someone alive. The police officers initially focused their attention on Bruce. The deceased was found wearing only underwear, apparently sleeping when he heard a strange noise and went to the stairs to see what was happening. He received numerous blows to the head, and his body also had stab wounds that might have come from a knife. Additionally, numerous defensive wounds on the arms were observed, resulting from an uneven fight with the murderer. On the floor in a pool of blood, the police found a lock of hair that likely belonged to the victim himself. The head of the family was not immediately dead. Bruce was bloodied, and bloody footprints led up the stairs. It is evident that he lost consciousness halfway up and later simply slid down and died on the stairs. On the walls and on the floor, there were blood splatters from blows with a heavy object, as well as from slit veins from which blood flowed. There were additional tracks that clearly did not belong to the first victim of the perpetrator. In all the rooms where the sleeping members of the Bennett family had been, bloody handprints led up the stairs. The investigators cautiously went up the stairs, checking whether the intruder might still be in the house. He could have been injured in the attack and pose a danger. Next, they found Deborah. She lay face up at the foot of the bed on the floor in a pool of her own blood. The young mother was also wearing only underwear, probably caught by the murderer in her sleep. She apparently tried to cover herself in panic as the bedding was crumpled, but this did not protect her from the numerous stab and beat injuries, similar to those of her husband. On the nightstand were her handbag and her clothes, and a shelf had been pulled out. At first glance, it seemed as if the perpetrator had taken nothing, Perhaps he was looking for something specific, or he had decided to stage a robbery in a not very convincing way. The police then entered the children's room and found Melissa, who was also lying next to the bed on the floor. The child had been killed in the same way as her parents. The girl had struggled desperately, so she had stab wounds on her hands. She was dead and wearing her pajamas. Next to Melissa's bed, the shelf of her nightstand had also been pulled out. In the back corner of the room was a widely bloodied corpse, Vanessa, the youngest daughter. The bed where the girl had been was splattered with blood, and the child had also suffered several severe wounds. The 3-year-old Vanessa was still fighting for her life but was in a serious condition. Emergency services were immediately called to the scene and took the girl to a local hospital, where she received first aid and underwent major surgery as her jaw had been shattered by the impact of a hammer-like instrument. Her arms and legs were also shredded, and she lost a lot of blood from her head injuries. The youngest daughter of the family survived several operations and lengthy therapeutic procedures, and the doctors managed to restore mobility to her limbs, but the child still had a long way to go in her recovery. The police officers at the scene meticulously collected all possible evidence that could contain traces of the madman who had orchestrated this bloody massacre. Special attention was paid to the girl's room, where a suspicious blood trail suggested the murderer had lingered there for some reason, almost on the eve of Melissa's tragic birthday. Also, on the blanket crumpled on the bed was a white spot that resembled a stain from male fluids. After the investigators had carefully examined the scene of the tragedy, they constructed the picture of the terrible attack. When Bruce was awakened in the night by a strange noise, the young father went downstairs to see what was happening. As he went down the stairs, he heard a rustling from the direction of the garage and the kitchen. Bruce called his children's names, thinking one of the girls had woken up and wanted something to eat. However, at the foot of the stairs, the silhouette of a stranger appeared. Bruce realized it was a stranger and tried to warn the rest of the family of the danger, but at that moment, the unknown assailant attacked him and struck him on the head. In the darkness, the young father could not see who it was or what he was being hit with. In the next second, a dark shadow approached the confused young man and slit his throat. His family did not wake up from the noise. Bruce Bennett was left bleeding on the stairs. Meanwhile, the villain made his way upstairs and headed straight for the bedroom of the dying man's wife, Deborah. She was the next target and the only adult in the house who could still resist. Unfortunately, the young mother also noticed the danger too late. The intruder attacked and began beating her. After several blows to the head, Deborah lost consciousness, after which the perpetrator inflicted several deadly stabs. Apart from the 2 murdered adults, only small children were left, but the perpetrator did not stop there. He entered the girl's room and first attacked Melissa. He also beat the child until she no longer resisted and then stabbed her, as with the previous victims. Vanessa suffered the same fate. The murderer beat her and ended with several stab wounds. After the carnage, he simply walked away, leaving 4 bodies behind, from which, miraculously, 1 girl survived. The police found suspicious footprints in and around the garage where Deborah's handbag, its contents thrown onto the ground, was located. Initially, it was hard to say whether anything was missing without knowing the entire contents, but the murderer had clearly rummaged through it. A few meters from the garage, a large butcher knife was found, apparently from the family's kitchen cutlery, likely drawn by the noise of the intruder and attempted to stop him, but eventually became the first victim. At this time, the investigators already knew that the massacre had been committed with multiple weapons simultaneously, and it could not be ruled out that there were 2 perpetrators, each using a different weapon. A knife was found on the street, and during the investigation, it was discovered to have been used for the wounds. The second weapon was a bludgeoning tool resembling a hammer or something similar. The investigators later suspected that it was a tool since they found traces of it on the wall. It was clear that the perpetrator had randomly struck furniture and objects, causing a lot of destruction, glass shards, and other damages. An important piece of evidence was the perpetrator's shoe prints. He wore work boots that resembled construction boots, and their prints were found in all rooms he passed through. After analyzing the number and type of prints, the investigators concluded that they had been left by a single person, which meant that there was a criminal without accomplices who used two weapons at once to massacre defenseless people. Constance surveyed the house carefully, but in her opinion, nothing had been stolen. The only thing that could have been missing was the money from Deborah's wallet. Of course, the mother-in-law did not know how much money was in it, and there were no living witnesses who could confirm this suspicion. The medical examiners determined that all the deceased and the surviving girl had suffered head injuries from the hammer, which were the cause of death for Deborah and Melissa. Bruce, however, did not die from this. He also received several severe blows to the head, but his cause of death was his slit throat. The murderer left him bleeding on the stairs. Bruce probably even heard his wife and children dying but could do nothing more. Swabs were taken from the bodies of the woman and the children to perform DNA tests. In those years, however, this test was still far from the accuracy of modern techniques, so the only thing the medical examiners could determine from the tests was the blood type of the person who had left the sperm at the scene of the massacre. It turned out that the mother and the two girls had been raped, and of course, all DNA samples were secured to convict the perpetrator. However, the police still had no clues and not a single suspect in the initial phase of the investigation. Despite the available traces, the collected fingerprints, and the DNA samples, with the existing databases, no matches could be found. Naturally, this was still in the early stages at that point and did not further the investigation. It seemed as if the incident would become an unsolved case that would gather dust on the shelves of the archives. Fortunately, this was not the case. The murderer struck again, and this was the turning point in the investigation. Within just 2 weeks, there were a series of attacks where a hammer was used. The attack on the Bennett family was just one episode in a bloody series by the maniac the media called the Hammer Murderer. It turned out that there had been 3 similar attacks in the area before. The very first attack occurred on January 4, 1984. On that day, the monster's wrath hit the newly married couple Kim and Jim Hodoff, who also lived in Aurora, Colorado. The attacker broke into their house in the middle of the night and attacked the couple when they least expected it. Jim was awakened by a hammer blow to the face, then the attacker threw the same weapon at Kim, causing her a concussion. While the injured Jim chased the attacker, he called emergency services, but the police officers could not find the attacker that night. Both survived but were seriously injured in the attack. Unfortunately, no one saw the face of the murderer at the time of the attack. The woman's purse was removed from the house. The second attack occurred 5 days later, on January 9, 1984. A 20-year-old from Aurora named Donna Dixon returned home late in the evening. She lived alone at home at the time because her fiancé Ronald was a pilot and had taken a flight overnight. He only returned the next morning and immediately noticed that the garage of Donna's house was open. Donna's handbag lay before him on the ground, its contents scattered across the driveway, along with the mail. Another victim of the maniac. The young man immediately noticed that near the driver's door of the car lay the girl's clothes, and blood traces led into the house, up to the bedroom where the victim of the attack lay. Donna Dixon suffered severe head injuries. The pervert had also attacked her with a hammer, attempted to kill her, and raped her. Fortunately, the girl was still alive when her fiancé discovered her and was taken to a nearby medical center, where doctors diagnosed severe brain damage. Ronald slept with a weapon in the hospital outside her room to protect his beloved until Donna was assigned police protection. Donna underwent multiple surgeries and gradually regained basic movement and speech functions. Initially, she had the intelligence of a 2-year-old and relearned how to eat and speak, but Ronald did not abandon her. He supported and helped her repeatedly. Later they married, and after a while, Donna was able to lead a fulfilled life, but the physical and mental effects of the attack remained for life. The memories of the bloody attack never revived, so she was not able to contribute to the capture of the maniac who terrorized the city. Another victim of the maniac was Patricia, a resident of the city of Lakewood in the state of Colorado. The maniac also inflicted numerous blows to her head with a hammer, such that she had no chance of survival. The 50-year-old woman had moved to the area just before the attack, while her daughter had 2 children, worked, and was a single mother. Thus, the grandmother was raising the children. Another victim of the maniac moved to this woman to help her take care of her grandchildren. Patricia was found in her apartment, beaten to death with a hammer. The murderer had previously entered through the widely open garage door, delivered numerous blows to her head such that she had no chance of survival, and raped the woman. According to the medical examiners, she was attacked between 1300 hours and 1500 hours in the afternoon when Patricia came home from work during her lunch break. The signature of the murderer matched completely, except for the single circumstance that this time he struck in the afternoon. Yet, here too, a large number of DNA samples of the attacker were found, although the attack occurred in broad daylight, which was quite untypical for a maniac. The other aspects of the crime were identical to the preceding series of bloody crimes. Unfortunately, this still gave the police no serious leads. An obvious attacker must have lived near the locations where he found his victims. Then came the attack on the Bennett family, in which 3 people were killed at once. The investigators were again frustrated, they were powerless, and the investigation stagnated. In the meantime, the dissatisfaction among the population grew by the hour. The residents realized that the criminal from the area was terrorizing the neighborhood and obviously would not stop. This meant that everyone was in danger, and no one could sleep peacefully anymore. On January 24th, FBI agents got involved in the investigations, reviewing all files, creating a psychological profile of the murderer, and needing to solve the crimes as quickly as possible. It became clear to them that all massacres had been committed by the same person. According to the profile, the perpetrator was a young man with an extensive criminal past. Since he was so successful in his break-ins, he must have had a past as a burglar. According to the FBI agents, the attacker was in his early 20s and was likely trying to fund himself and his bad habits through murder and theft. During the careful examination of the records, another important detail emerged: all the crimes were committed near a local construction site, and the shoe prints resembled the boots of construction workers, suggesting that the maniac worked as a construction worker and was regularly employed at various companies. The team that was supposed to investigate these attacks in detail, however, would never start their work because the case took an unexpected turn. Early in the morning of January 27th, Roy Williams woke up in the small town of Kingman, Arizona, in his bed, suffering severe pain in his head. He saw a stranger attempting to smash his head with hammer blows. As he woke up, the next victim kept his composure. Roy even spoke to his attacker, which distracted the murderer. Roy asked the attacker why he was doing this, but he didn't answer and suddenly fled the house without completing his bloody intent. Unlike all other cases, the victim miraculously escaped with only minor injuries that did not prevent him from remembering his attacker or identifying him. After getting a good look at the villain and remembering him perfectly, the man called the emergency services and the police. He was taken to the hospital with broken ribs and a head injury, needing over 100 stitches to repair his head and mutilated face, but Roy was the luckiest of all the attacker's victims. Police officers responded as quickly as possible to the case. A patrol was immediately after the attack in pursuit of the attacker. A few hours after the assault, one of the law enforcement officers was lucky not to be far from the house where another attack had been committed. He noticed a young man who looked disheveled and very nervous. He fidgeted around trying to catch a car and hitchhike away. The officer approached him, but he immediately ran off and hid in the bushes but was eventually caught and arrested. In the apartment of the last victim of the murderer, shoe prints were found that matched numerous prints from other victims' apartments. Initially, the shoes of the arrested individual were checked. They matched 100%. A large amount of blood traces was found on the sole. He was also identified by Roy Williams. The name of the detainee was Alex Ewing. He was a former carpenter and handyman who had worked on this construction site. In his short lifespan, he had managed to build an extensive criminal past. The profile created for the unknown perpetrator had determined his age at the time of the arrest as accurately as possible. The man was 20 years old. The profile was also not wrong about his profession and his experience with burglaries. Alex Ewing was immediately charged with attempted murder of Roy Williams and first-degree robbery, and evidence began to be collected to charge him for other assaults. He was taken to the Maha County Jail, where he would wait for a hearing in his case. Since the facility was overcrowded, he was moved a few months later to the State Penitentiary of Utah, where he was to remain until his trial scheduled for August 9, 1984. It was then decided to transfer him along with several other prisoners to Arizona. The maniac was moved in a specially equipped transporter. During the 5-hour drive, the convoy reached Henderson, Nevada. The vehicle was forced to stop for refueling. In the meantime, the prisoners were released to use the restroom while they paid for the gasoline. The guards were distracted, and just at that moment, while Alex Ewing was in the restroom, the criminal seized the opportunity and escaped. His disappearance was quickly noticed, and a search operation was initiated. The escorts requested additional support from the Henderson Police Department, and a large-scale search for the fugitive began. Around 10 p.m., 2 reports came in from the town that a suspicious man was lurking in the homes of a residential area. His description was similar to that of Alex Ewing. Apparently, he wanted to strike again. The murderer was considered particularly dangerous. He really had nothing to lose, and so all police officers rushed to the area to search for the fugitive. An hour and a half after the first report, the 20-year-old Barry called the police. She and her family had been attacked by an unknown assailant. The woman was awakened in the middle of the night by the crying of her youngest child and went to the kitchen to prepare a bottle of milk. At that moment, Alex attacked her, and she tried to run away from him. Her husband heard her screams and rushed to her aid, receiving several blows with the edge of an axe. The perpetrator then fled. No one was killed, but the husband suffered a broken arm. The children remained unharmed. However, the husband sustained a severe head injury but survived. The woman was able to escape only because she managed the critical situation and pretended to be dead. During the search of the house of the next victim, the police found that the handwriting matched completely with the habits of the fugitive. The axe used as the murder weapon was found on the kitchen floor. Unfortunately, Alex himself could not be caught. He managed to escape the police again. In the following days, every patrol in the city tried in vain to track him down and catch him. He seemed to have disappeared and gone into hiding again. Finally, on the 4th day, a young woman came to the station and reported suspicious calls from the area around Lake Mead. It turned out that the caller was an unknown young man who claimed he was hiding from the police and needed help. He tried unsuccessfully to arouse the woman's sympathy, but fortunately, she was not confused, turned off the madness of the crazy, and turned to the state police. The patrol officers immediately went to the aforementioned address and indeed discovered Ewing hiding in one of the local abandoned houses. When he realized he had been discovered, he opened fire on the police officers with a weapon stolen from the apartment of the last victim. Fortunately, the criminal was not hit. He was arrested, and with that, the series of bloody crimes was ended. The suspect was charged with attacking Roy, escaping from custody, 2 burglaries, and attempted murder of Nancy and her husband. Investigations were still ongoing in the previous cases, and evidence for a charge was being collected. The prosecution made all files and arguments known, and the jurors entered into deliberation to render a verdict. After several hours of deliberation, he was found guilty and sentenced to 110 years in prison. In 1989, the Aurora Police Department was still working on the case of the Bennett family, in which 3 people had been killed. The investigators collected and analyzed DNA traces found at the scene of the massacre. Unfortunately, the quality of the materials and the technology of the time did not allow for comprehensive information and no 100% proof of the belonging of the traces of male sperm found on Melissa's blanket. We only had to wait until 2001 when new technologies enabled a complete DNA profile to be created. At this point, however, it was necessary to match everything with the perpetrator himself, who was under jurisdiction in another state in Nevada. This led to difficulties, and it was not until 2016 that the DNA profile could be matched to the suspect when the law was repealed. It took another 2 years for the genetic material of the perpetrator to be included in the database. By this time, the CODIS database was already active, so the involvement of the perpetrator in the murder of Patricia could be confirmed. The media was interested in the case for almost half a century and finally managed to move the investigations away from a dead point. It turned out that the DNA found at the scene of the massacre of the Bennett family matched Alex completely. Ewing himself denied his involvement in the attacks, but it was evident that the death of an entire family was the work of his hands. The maniac was charged with triple first-degree murder and attempted murder and had to be extradited from Nevada to Colorado, where his criminal activities began. Every step of the way, the criminal tried to obstruct the prosecution with the help of his lawyer. A psychiatric report found him sane. The trial in the case of the Bennett family then took place in July 2021. Vanessa, who miraculously survived the Ewing attack in 1984, took the floor during the trial. She told the jurors about the problems she had in her life because of the actions of this monster. Her story moved many to tears. Alex Ewing was found guilty on August 6, 2021, on all charges. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences with parole after 80 years. The case of Patricia Smith proved to be even more complex. This trial also took place in 2021. The devil's lawyer continued to defend him at all costs, uncovering errors and inconsistencies in the investigations. Therefore, the trial was declared invalid. The defendant claimed he had committed no bodily harm and had been framed. A new trial in 2022 for Patricia Smith led to a conviction for first-degree murder and rape. Alex also received a life sentence for this crime. To this day, he is incarcerated at the Colorado Territorial Correctional Institution in Nin City. The other cases in which Alex Ewing was a suspect remain unresolved due to a lack of evidence or because of the statute of limitations. The investigators are sure that he is the one who committed them since Alex was active in this area at the time and they were committed with a similar modus operandi. Perhaps one day he will also be charged for these crimes, but one thing is comforting: Alex Ewing will never walk free again. Although Vanessa miraculously survived the attack, she not only lost her family but also herself. All her life, she suffered from the effects of a lifelong psychological and physical trauma, including PTSD, ADHD, and bipolar disorder. She suffered from partial paralysis of the left side of her body, memory problems, and for a time struggled with dependence on illegal substances and thoughts of suicide. Fortunately, she managed to cope with these. Today, she is 42 years old and lives with her second husband in Arizona. The victim of a maniac dreams of writing a book to help people who are struggling with similar problems. After the murderer of her family was caught and punished, she could finally experience peace and relief, according to her statements. Around 8 a.m. on the morning of April 22, 2016, the police in Pike County in southern Ohio received a shocking call. On the other end of the line, the trembling voice of a woman reported that there was blood everywhere. Her breathing was irregular, and she could not provide further details. After a few minutes, she managed to explain what had happened and reported that she had found her brother-in-law and his cousin severely injured. The police immediately drove to the crime scene. As they approached the house, a neighbor asked them to stop because he wanted to give them 2 more addresses of relatives of the victims. He had a feeling that they too had been attacked. At the same time, the woman discovered 2 more people in another house. The death toll began to rise as the officers visited the 3 trailers. There were already 7 dead, all killed in their sleep by gunshot wounds. As if that were not enough, by noon it was discovered that another member of the same family had been found dead. The only survivors were a 3-year-old child, a 6-month-old infant, and a 4-day-old baby. Little Sophie, who was with her father, also survived, as if she knew she needed protection that night. The Rodens were a large family from Ohio, USA. Christopher Roden was married to Dana Roden, and they had 3 children together, Frankie, Hannah Mae, and Christopher Jor. In 2016, Christopher and Dana were living separately but on the same property on Union Hill Road in rural Pike, Ohio, which they owned. The 40-year-old man worked as a craftsman at the Berg Lake Peak complex owned by the family and lived with his 38-year-old cousin Harry in a trailer. The 37-year-old Dana worked as a nurse aide in a rehabilitation center for youth. She lived with her younger children, who were 19 and 16 at the time, in a trailer 2 kilometers away from her ex-husband. Hannah's 2-year-old daughter Sophie spent most of her time with them. Frankie, now 20 years old, lived in another trailer nearby with his fiancée Hannah. He had a 3-year-old son from a previous relationship and a 6-month-old baby with his new partner. Frankie spent most of his time helping his father on the property. Soon, Kent, Christopher's brother, also joined the family. Like the rest of his relatives, he was a hard-working man and drove to Columbus every day to work. His house was only 15 minutes away from the rest of his relatives. On April 18, 2016, the Roden family grew larger with the birth of a new daughter, whose father was unknown. Hannah wanted to find out nothing about it because she had a poor relationship with Jake Wagner, Sophie's father. Hannah believed that all worries about the newborn should stay within her family. She planned to raise 2 little girls alone while working as a nurse aide in finishing school. The relationship between the Rodens was so good that they even took in Dana's sister, Bobby Jo Manley, into the family because she was unemployed. Christopher offered her a job as an animal caretaker since the property they lived on was very large. Bobby accepted the offer without suspecting that during one of these visits, the most terrible scene imaginable would occur. On the morning of April 22, 2016, at 7:53 a.m., Bobby entered the trailer as she did every day. She immediately noticed that the house was not empty. Inside, Christopher and Gary lay in a huge pool of blood. The woman grabbed her cell phone and dialed the emergency number with a shaky voice, asking them to come to Union Hill Road 47. Then, as if on reflex, Bobby made her way to the house of her other relatives. She knocked on the door, but no one answered. Seconds later, Frankie's 3-year-old son came out of the house. The alarmed woman entered the house and what she saw took her breath away. On the bed lay the lifeless bodies of Frankie and his wife. Next to them lay a 6-month-old baby, alive but bloodstained. While the police were on their way to the crime scene, they were intercepted by a neighbor of the Roden family. He urged them to check 2 more nearby houses because there were likely more dead there, and he was right. In the 3rd house, the officers found the bodies of Dana, Christopher Jor, and Hannah, all blood-stained. The only survivor in this house was a little girl who was just a few days old. When the news reached Donald Stone, a relative of the Rodens, He went to make sure they were safe, but unfortunately, he had also suffered a gunshot wound. Donald called the police and reported that he had found the last body. By 2 p.m., the victims had been found. There were 8: Christopher, Dana, Frankie, Hannah, Christopher Jor, and their daughter Hannah Mae, Kenneth, and Gary. The only survivors were small children who were not touched by the murderers. Little Sophie, who was at her father Jake's house, also survived. Through the examination of the bodies, the investigators were able to reconstruct the crimes. Christopher had a defensive wound on his right arm, leading them to conclude that he was awake when the murderers entered his house. He confronted his attackers but was hit by a hail of new bullets. Harry was shot 5 times. Dana received the same number of shots to the head and neck, some even fired after she was already dead, suggesting that the perpetrators had gone amok. Christopher Jor was shot 4 times in the head, as was Frankie. Hannah was also shot twice in the skull. Kenneth was the only one shot once. All the victims died from multiple shots fired at close range. The investigators estimated that the murderers had fired a total of 32 shots. Apparently, a silencer was used since no one in the area heard anything. Furthermore, all the victims had plastic bags on their arms and various bruises. The cover-up revealed that at least one of the victims had 9 severe wounds. It was obvious that this was a planned crime to eliminate the entire family, but the investigators did not understand who could have committed such a heinous crime. During the search of the house, the police found 5 different types of Remington cartridge cases. They also found an additional unused cartridge that belonged to another model, confirming the suspicion that more than one attacker was involved. Although the blood of the victims was found in all the houses, none of them contained the DNA of the perpetrator. The investigators tried to view the surveillance material from the houses, but the devices had been disabled. No DNA was found here either. Obviously, those who had planned the crime had thought it through very carefully. Just when hope seemed lost, the officers discovered something. It was quickly suspected that the Rodens were involved in illegal substance trafficking, as is common in Ohio. The likely motive for the crime was revenge. The officers checked whether the family had connections to cartels or drug dealers but found nothing. They investigated the possibility of a family feud over drug money, but that was not conclusive either. The investigators also noticed cages with fighting cocks in one of the 4 trailers. However, it turned out that illegal cockfights were not the cause of the incident. They were about to leave the site without discovering anything until an important witness came forward. Leonard Manley, Dana's father, assured the investigators that the murderers must have been familiar with the family, otherwise, the dogs would have attacked them. This, and the fact that there were no signs of forced entry in either house, narrowed down the suspects. The Attorney General of Ohio, Mike Darwin, said it was a cold-blooded crime, and the murderer was still at large and armed. Efforts were made to locate the remaining members of the Rodens to keep them safe. 30 investigators traveled across the state, combing every street and house. They also questioned all the family's acquaintances to find out what had happened. This triggered a wave of panic in Pike County, creating such insecurity that a businessman named Jeff Roby offered $25,000 for information that would help the police. In January 2017, the first result of the investigation appeared, but it turned out to be only incidental. A close relative of the Rodens named Josh was arrested for drug possession. Months passed, and the police could not even find a motive. They questioned 550 people, collected 1,100 witness statements, and analyzed hundreds of pieces of evidence. On April 13, 2017, the authorities were forced to deliver the hard news. They told the media that they did not have enough evidence to make arrests. However, prosecutor Rob Young said they had some leads that they could not yet release. A few days later, the the incident was commemorated for the first time. A fair and a small memorial service were organized, attended by all the authorities. The massacre of the Roden family is still being talked about, but after 2 years, only the locals were still interested in the case. Neither the local press nor the sheriff or the prosecutor appeared at the second fair. It seemed as if the largest criminal investigation in the district's history was being forgotten, and that was the case until June, when a very important clue arrived. The words of the prosecutor turned out to be true, and for the first time, he informed the public that he was interested in the Wagner family, to which Hannah's former partner belonged. The focus was on George Wagner III, his wife Angela Wagner, both 47 years old, and their 2 sons, George Wagner IV, 27 years old, and Edward Wagner, 26 years old, known as Jake. They all lived within a 25-kilometer radius of the accident site. The problem was that the Wagners had already traveled to Kenai, a small town in Alaska, by this time. They took little Sophie with them, who had remained in her father's custody after Hannah's death. They justified their departure by saying that they loved the Rodens very much, and their death had caused them great pain. Rob Young turned to the public for information about the Wagners, but they did not have to wait long for their arrival. Soon they ran out of money and had to move back to Ohio. In preparation for their arrest, the agents found out how the relationship between the 2 families ended in a bloodbath. Jake Wagner met Hannah Roden in high school when he was 18 and she was only 13. They went to prom together and had been inseparable since then. This also brought the 2 families closer together, and they began to meet and celebrate together. When Hannah was 15, she became pregnant by Jake. Shortly after Sophie's birth, her boyfriend suggested she move in with him and his family. He believed that his daughter would grow up in a healthier environment. Hannah did not agree, as she felt it was an attempt to control her, and from then on, it went downhill. Both wanted full custody of the child, and each family fought for their own interests. One day, Jake went so far as to suggest to Hannah that she sign a document granting him and his brother custody. When he saw that she did not comply with his request, Jake began to threaten her. He wrote to Hannah that he would take Sophie away from her by force if necessary. Jake also tried to manipulate her by telling her that if she really loved her daughter, she would know that she should live with him. According to the same reports, the boyfriend believed that the Rodens might harm the girl. These conversations lasted for 2 years. In March 2015, Hannah decided to end her relationship with Jake because he was abusing her too much. In a message, she made it clear that he had hurt her and that she was fed up with his harassment. Such violent acts were commonplace in the Wagner family. George IV obtained full custody of his son by threatening his ex-girlfriend with a weapon. Things got even worse when Hannah announced that she was expecting a second daughter, although she denied that Jake was the father. He was not entirely sure, as there had been intimacies between the 2 recently. In December 2015, Angela Wagner hacked into Hannah's social media account and discovered something that greatly angered the family. The girl had corresponded with the former mother-in-law of George K., telling her that her ex-partner's family would have to kill her to gain custody of their daughter. A few weeks before the event, the Wagners tried one last time to persuade Hen to give Jake full custody of Shy, but Hen refused again. Then Rita Newcomb, Jake's maternal grandmother, forged documents to achieve this. During the legal dispute, George the Dr. and Christopher had a heated argument about where their granddaughter should live, and relations between the 2 families had already completely deteriorated. Then the Wagners began planning the crime. On Christmas Day 2016, they voted on whether they wanted to kill the Roden family to obtain custody of Sophie. Everyone agreed. For months, they planned the murder. They studied the daily routine of the Roden family, their working hours, their sleeping times, and their living situation. They also examined their surveillance cameras. They even went so far as to fire shots into the air on the property where they lived to see if the shots made a sound. After they determined that the noise could betray them, George III decided it was best to buy parts for homemade silencers. Angela bought her husband and children's sneakers to wear on the day of the crime, which they would later destroy. She also bought a device to disrupt communication, which she secretly installed on the victims' phones so that they could not call for help. George IDR made sure that a van was available that night so that no one would recognize them. Sophie was with the Wagners on the night of the accident because Hannah and Jake had joint custody, and it was his turn that day. Angela stayed home with the girl while George III came to Christopher's house to persuade him to join the alleged drug ring. He agreed and opened the door to his house without knowing what would happen next. The authorities managed to find evidence that Angela had bought the sneakers weeks before the murder. They matched a bloody footprint left on the floor of one of the trailers. It could also be proven that she had hacked into the account of her ex-sister-in-law. When examining the electronic devices of the Wagners, the officers found internet searches about parental rights, clearly showing that they were obsessed with controlling their children. Although Angela was clearly the mastermind of the plan, the investigators were sure that Jake had staged the murders and that all members of the Wagner family were involved. On November 30, 2018, the authorities announced the arrest of 6 people, and now only the trial had to be awaited. In 2019, Rita Newcomb passed a handwriting test in which she was found guilty of forging a custody document for Sophia. In December, the woman agreed to a deal to avoid prison. The other Wagners remained behind bars and refused to cooperate in the investigations. They even said they were sad about the death of the Rodens and expressed the desire to see the real murderers in prison. It seemed as if the case would never be closed and the people in Ohio would not be able to sleep peacefully again. 2 years later, however, something unexpected happened. On April 22, 2021, the 5th anniversary of the mass murder, Jake struck a deal with the prosecution. The condition was that his family members would receive life sentences instead of the death penalty. He confessed to killing 5 of the 8 victims and pleaded guilty to 23 charges, including 8 for serious murder, the others for conspiracy, robbery, tampering with evidence, and unlawful intimacy with a minor. He stated that he felt the need to take Hannah's life to gain custody of his daughter. After he had killed her, he had to do the same with the rest of the Rodens because he knew they would seek revenge. Yet he showed deep remorse. Jake was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. After the trial, he agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in the proceedings against his parents and brother. This led to the discovery of a van that George IDR had specifically bought for the raid and 3 firearms that the family had tried to dismantle to burn. They were buried in cement buckets and hidden behind the pond of the Wagner house. A specialist was able to recover the fragments and determine that the cartridge cases matched those found in the Rodens' homes. On September 10 of the same year, Angela pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit serious murder, robbery, and tampering with evidence. In return, the prosecutor dropped the murder charge against her. Angela was sentenced to 30 years in prison. On August 28, 2022, the trial against George Wagner IV began. The prosecution claimed that he was involved in the planning, execution, and cover-up of the murders. The man, however, denied knowing about the deeds before, during, and after the murders. He even said that he would never have agreed if his family had asked him to participate in such a case. 3 months later, George VI was found guilty on all 22 charges and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. George IDR is still awaiting his trial, which is scheduled for February 2024. If he is found guilty on the same 22 charges as his son, he will face the same fate. Although the entire family has been convicted, he continues to proclaim his innocence. The surviving children were left in the custody of distant relatives. Out of respect for their privacy, their whereabouts are not disclosed, but it is known that they are happy and safe. The Wagner's goal was to gain custody of Sophia. They vowed to take better care of her, but in reality, they took her away from her biological mother, her aunt, her uncle, and her grandparents. The only thing one can hope for is that she will grow up far from her father's family and in an environment where violence will never be a means. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourself.